in about 5 minutes. So I'll give you an update then. So come on in, get settled, get your last minute prep ready. We're going to have a pretty good discussion here. Everybody, nice to see you. We got lots of people I've seen before, many more people I haven't seen before. So especially if it's your first time checking in at a Socialist Fight Back online event, welcome to you. I hope you enjoy it. I'll just explain what we're doing here really quickly. But first, I'm Michael. I'm an activist with Socialist Fight Back, et la riposte socialiste. in Montreal. But we're not just based out of Montreal. While we have quite a few people here, we have organizations in most cities in Canada at this point. And in particular, we are a member organization of an international Marxist tendency. In fact, the International Marxist Tendency is what we're called. And I will get into more information about that in a sec. We are a revolutionary socialist organization. We have organizations in more than 30 countries in the world, and we are doing our best to make that number even bigger. We have a couple new sections, brand new sections in India and in Taiwan. So shout out to those two brand new international sections. But we've had sections in countries like Pakistan, countries all over Europe, countries all over South America, North America, every continent except for Antarctica. And maybe one day we can even change that too. So, yeah, we are an organization that we get together. We hold events like this. We also do a lot more things, but for providing information and for producing information, theory and practice for ending capitalism. I don't think in my life, I haven't seen an event quite like coronavirus or anything like it that shows exactly how much we need to get past this economic system that is really not handling these problems very effectively. So we're going to learn a lot more about that through this event. We've been learning about that through events that we've been holding all semester long. We've been doing this Marxist University thing for now quite a few months. I recognize a few names from people who've been to past events. So hopefully you've been finding them interesting if you keep coming back. Some things that we've talked about, we've talked about, I'm just looking at the list of things here, an analysis of economics, capitalist economics and Marxist economics, about the question of the police, this demand to abolish the police that was getting raised in the United States for a little while there. Fascism, how to fight it, Marxism versus other philosophical questions. So there's all this theory, there's econ, and then there's, these questions of what was the Soviet Union? Was it socialist or not? What's the difference between Marxism and anarchism? So we've covered a whole range of different questions. And today we have kind of a special event that's a little bit different than all the other ones, that we are going to do a book launch. So I'm going to show you the book. I have a copy of it. It's right here. It's called The First 5 Years of the Communist International, volumes 1 and 2. It's a republication of a lot of text, as you can see. It's 800 pages or so. These are writings of Leon Trotsky, who is one of the main theoreticians and members of the Communist International organization that existed from 1919 onwards. I will let our speaker, Rob, tell you more about that in a minute, but here's the book. And if you're interested in getting a copy of this yourself, if you already know something about it, and maybe you want to take a look at it, I'm sure wherever you're watching this, whether on Facebook or in Zoom or wherever else we're streaming, there will be links shared that will let you see where to get a copy of this yourself. It looks cool on your bookshelf. And more importantly, there's a lot of really interesting information in here. I mean, this is what's this book about? To me, it's remembering a time when there was an international revolutionary organization that was holding democratic discussions about how to address worldwide problems like the crisis of capitalism, pandemic, and economic crisis. And surprisingly, this isn't talking about 2020. This is actually 1920. So we have a little bit of a rhyme with history here, that these are lessons and analysis of communists from all over the world, not just Russia, like Leon Trotsky, but communists from places like India and China and Britain and Canada and the United States and Europe and Africa. We're all at these meetings. And in here we have analysis and writings and minutes and debates and speeches and articles of all of these different participants. So it's kind of interesting that we're doing something similar here. We will be having our own democratic discussion of the content of these ideas. First of all, just to describe the event a little bit more, Rob will be taking over from me in a couple minutes, talking about this book and a bunch of the lessons from it. I'll let him do that. Afterwards, this will be about half an hour. After about half an hour, we will break out into discussion. So anything that you'd like to bring up, if you already know a bunch of stuff about this and you want to tell us more that Rob didn't get to tell us, you get to do that. More importantly, if you have questions, if anything that Rob said or anything we said or anything in this book said, you don't really quite understand or you want to know more about, we can raise questions, publicly discuss. I will be chairing this discussion. So in order to participate, you have to be on Zoom. That's how I'll see you. There is a raise hand function in Zoom. If you take a look at the participants menu and you click a button, it lets you raise your hand. And so I'll keep note as you raise your hands, and I'll limit it to about 3 minutes each, so everybody has time to speak. A little bit of flexibility there, of course. What I do ask is just a couple things. That in order to participate in the discussion, to keep it as much like a real life event as possible, I just would ask that everybody who wants to discuss to please turn on your webcam. This is really just to make it more like a real life event, and also just prevent anybody who's just happened to be trolling. It's one little barrier that you remove from just somebody who isn't really actually interested. So I'll just ask that you have your webcam on if you'd like to speak. You raise your hand in the participant menu, and I will jot you down and get you in on the discussion. And then after the event, just to simulate what we'd also normally do in real life, we'll be splitting up into breakout rooms to discuss a little bit more informally. Normally in real life, we'd go to the bar or something like that and relax. I guess this is still real life, but digitally online, we'll go to the digital bar on Zoom and relax and talk about the ideas a bit more. I've already introduced the book. If you want more information about the book, I believe it's been shared in the chat. You can also find more information about our organization. I will talk about this more later in the event, but if you're interested in getting involved, finding a branch near you, you are more than welcome to check that out in our links. And I believe I have said everything that I want to say so far. So without further ado, I will let Rob take it from here. So first of all, I will find Rob in the list of participants. I will unmute him, and then we can get started. Okay.
There we go. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Michael. So have people been glued to the TV watching the presidential election coverage? I was actually getting a bit sick of it, but I just watched Trump make a speech, which was completely off the wall. This was kind of interesting to see the CNN analysts collectively lose their minds. But anyway, other topics. Yes, as Michael mentioned, a new edition of the first 5 years of the Communist International has been released by the International Marxist Tendency in well-read books. And yes, this is a collection of Trotsky's writings from the first 4 congresses of the Communist International. So following the October Revolution of 1917, there was a revolutionary wave that swept across Europe and eventually most of the world. The Russian Revolution successfully brought the working class to power in Russia, but there were other revolutions or significant revolutionary movements in Finland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Poland, Spain, Italy, Bavaria, eventually the whole of Germany, and there were significant mass movements and strikes in France, Britain, China, and so on. The list is actually quite extensive. In Canada, there was what's known as the Labour Revolt of 1919. I think the most famous episode of this revolt was the Winnipeg General Strike, which spread to over 30 other cities from Amherst in Nova Scotia to Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver. And the Bolshevik Party, in particular Leon Trotsky, and along with him Lenin, and of course many others, they played a key role in setting up the Third, or the Communist International, which was a world revolutionary communist party of the working class, and which was established as part of this revolutionary wave that was sweeping the world. And the International wasn't established out of thin air. It didn't simply appear one day. And much like the Bolshevik Party itself, it had to be built through struggle against many different tendencies and many different ideas and through many different events. And so this book collects all of Trotsky's writings and speeches related to those first 5 years of the Communist International, during which the first 4 congresses of the Communist International took place. And so I guess people may be wondering, why is this important? Why is a book that's collecting Trotsky's writings from 100 years ago from these congresses, why is it important? Why are we discussing it? Well, Trotsky once described the Third International as a school of revolutionary strategy. And I think this is really why the book is important, because it deals with many fundamental questions and problems that the working class movement still faces to this very day. And so this book, and of course the actual congresses themselves, are an absolute treasure trove of lessons for workers and communists to this day. These questions and problems include economic questions, the question of the united front and the mass organizations of the working class. It deals with the question of how to deal with and approach the question of the reformist organizations, such as the mass social democratic parties and the trade unions. It deals with the national and the colonial questions, the consciousness of the working class and how that changes, how to build the party, and so on and so on. And so today, the capitalist system is facing the deepest crisis in its history, and we can see capitalist society coming apart at the seams. The US presidential election is another example of that. Yet we're faced with the same problem that Trotsky pointed out in 1924, that there is no mass international revolutionary Marxist organization of the working class with a clear understanding of the tasks at hand. And this is why this book is not just of historic interest. Rather, we should see it as a guide to action for all workers and youth seeking a revolutionary way out of the present crisis of the capitalist system. And so, what was the Third International or the Communist International? I think to sort of understand what it is and where it came from, I think we need to go back a little bit and look at its predecessors, the First and the Second Internationals. So the First International, which is known as the International Working Men's Association, was established in September 1864. And this was really the first serious attempt at building a united international organization of the working class. And the main goal was to unite the advanced leading layers of the working class, primarily in European countries, but also in North America. I think it's important that we understand that the First International was not really a Marxist international as such. It included British utopian socialists and reformist trade unionists. It included the followers of Lassalle in Germany. There were French Blanquists and Proudhonists. There was Italian reformists, nationalists, and anarchists. There were Russian anarchists. So there were people of all sorts of different political stripes who came together in the First International. And Marx and Engels adopted a very flexible approach when they were doing this work in the International, and they found ways to work with all these different tendencies and keep the International united, at least for a time. And at its height, the First International was established in more than 10 countries, but it was still quite weak, and many of the sections, in fact, had to operate in semi-legality or completely underground, in fact. But it did manage to involve tens of thousands and at times hundreds of thousands of workers in its various campaigns. And it goes without saying that the ruling class around the world absolutely hated the First International, and they attacked it mercilessly in the press, and they attacked Marx as well all the time. But the International faced a number of problems, and one of these problems was the fact that the labor movement, and in many countries actually, the working class itself was still in its infancy. It was still in the process of forming. There weren't really any mass socialist parties, or at least not as we know them today. And the trade unions, in fact, in many countries barely existed, and in some countries they didn't really exist at all. The Paris Commune of 1871 also posed a particular problem for the First International, and ultimately it caused the International to splinter. The British trade union leaders were on the right wing of the International, and they were generally more conservative than a lot of the other trends. And the tone of the International was becoming more radical at the time of the Paris Commune, and this made the British trade unionists a little bit uncomfortable, actually very uncomfortable. They weren't really revolutionaries, and the Paris Commune actually frightened them quite a bit. So when the Commune was finally defeated, the British trade unionists actually withdrew from the International, and this was kind of one of the first big splits in the First International. And in terms of the left wing, I guess kind of opposite to the British trade unionists, you had a lot of different anarchist tendencies, one of which was around Bakunin. And they kind of thought that the International wasn't radical enough. And so a deep division opened between Bakunin and Marx. Now that question is actually a lot more complicated than how I presented it here, but I won't have time to go into it now. But anyway, the Commune created a very difficult situation for the International. There was a whole period of capitalist upswing that followed the defeat of the Commune, and this, again, helped to pull the International apart. The International was being attacked on all sides, particularly in the bourgeois press. The counter-revolution in France had paralyzed the workers' movement there, and the links with the International were broken in France. Many workers, communards, and members of the First International, in fact, had to go into exile in London. So the movement was effectively smashed in France. Bakunin launched a whole series of political attacks on Marx, kind of threw the International into disarray. Some of the Italian nationalists also launched some attacks on the Commune and the International. And in Germany, Bismarck actually arrested the leadership, the German leaders of the International. And so because of this counter-revolutionary wave that followed the defeat of the Commune, the International lost its base in Germany and France, throughout much of Europe, and it really just couldn't function in Europe. So eventually there was a decision to move the headquarters to New York, and this caused some of the remaining French members, the Blanquistes in particular, to walk out of the International. And then this was followed by more splits and more splits. And eventually the whole thing was just falling apart, and it was just descending into infighting and factionalism, and it just wasn't functioning anymore. So eventually the First International was dissolved in 1876. And the First International was never a mass organization, but the historic task of the First International was to establish the main principles, the program, the strategy, and the tactics of revolutionary Marxism on a world scale. It succeeded in laying the theoretical foundations for a genuine revolutionary international. And so in this sense, that we can see the First International as an anticipation of the future. What it did do was establish the basis for the creation of mass social democratic parties throughout Europe, which took place in the 1870s and the 1880s after the First International was closed. And in July 1889, the International Socialist Congress met in Paris. And this Congress launched what became known as the Socialist International, or the Second International. Interestingly enough, May Day was also declared an international working class holiday at this Congress. And it also adopted the principles of the First International, which had been established by Marx and Engels just a few decades before. So in a certain sense, the Second International began where the first had left off. But unlike the first, the Second International began as a mass international and gathered and organized millions of workers around it. It had mass parties and affiliated trade unions in Germany, France, Britain, Belgium, and so on. Mostly European countries, but still. And importantly, the Second International, at least officially in words, was a Marxist international. It was, formally speaking, a revolutionary organization committed to socialism and the overthrowing of capitalism. But I guess it was a misfortune, I guess, that the Second International was actually formed during a long period of capitalist upswing. In fact, this was the same upswing that had caused all the problems for the First International. And Marxist organizations don't exist in a vacuum. The members of the organization, the workers of trade unions, we all live and work in a capitalist society, and this does impact consciousness and understanding of society. And based on this long capitalist upswing, the leaders and the parties of the Second International began to draw mistaken conclusions about the nature of capitalist society. The period from 1871 to 1914 was in fact the second greatest period of capitalist upswing in history, outdone only by the 30-year upswing that followed the Second World War. And it was a classic period of reformism. On the basis of this long period of economic growth, it was actually possible for capitalism to give concessions to the working class, especially the top layer of party and trade union bureaucrats. And although the leadership, such as figures as Karl Kautsky, officially adhered to the idea of socialism, in practice, the social democracy was actually carrying out reformist policies. And this led the leadership and the bureaucracies of these organizations to adapt to capitalist society, and they began to adopt policies of class collaboration. And this eventually led to the great betrayal of the working class in August 1914. Now, prior to this, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a kind of a constant threat of war as the imperialist powers were fighting for control of markets and colonies. And in response to this, in 1907, and again in 1912, the Second International passed resolutions against this coming war. Everybody knew a war was coming at some point. And they declared that the International would do everything to organize the working class to stop the war and to hasten the overthrow of capitalism. However, in August 1914, when the question of war credits, the money basically in the budget for the war, was proposed in the Reichstag in Germany, in German parliament, the German Social Democratic Party, in fact, voted for the war credits, as did the French Socialist Party. And so when the chips were down, the social democracy betrayed the working class, sided with their own national bourgeoisie, and this directly led to the great slaughter of World War I. So with the exception of the Bolsheviks in Russia, the Serbian Party, and as well as some opposition in the United States and eventually in Germany around Karl Liebknecht, the Second International in the main betrayed the principles of socialism and collaborated in the war that resulted in millions of workers fighting and killing each other on the battlefronts of Europe. But this betrayal didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't just a sudden thing. It was in fact a culmination of a long drawn out process that had been taking place pretty much over the course of the entire upswing. During the war, the parties of the Second International really descended into not just reformism, but nationalism and chauvinism as well, beating the war drums. They called for the defense of the fatherland and defended the interests of their own national bourgeoisie against the interests of the international working class. And after the war, the parties of the Second International actively betrayed the revolutionary movement of workers in country after country, notably in Russia, Germany, and Italy. Now, in many of the articles in this book, Trotsky actually spends quite a bit of time explaining this degeneration of the Second International and its causes. In fact, in the very first article of the book, Trotsky says the following. He says, "The task which had been placed on the order of the day by the Paris Congress, which was the founding Congress of the Second International, has not been realized. The formation of an international is the organization of international revolutionary proletarian action, with one center and with one international political orientation, had not been achieved. The Second International was merely a weak union of workers' parties which were independent of each other in their activity." And in another article, Trotsky commented that the French Socialist Party would say nothing when the German Social Democratic Party would release opportunist articles or make opportunist statements, and vice versa. In fact, the Germans wouldn't say anything when the French would say something opportunist. And this was because they didn't want to draw attention to the fact that they were also saying the same thing. So they kind of started to just ignore each other and allow each other to kind of descend into opportunist and class collaborationist politics. In the Manifesto of the Communist International to the Workers of the World, which is one of the first documents in the book, Trotsky explained the following. "Recognizing the world character of their tasks, the advanced workers have, from the very first steps of the organized socialist movement, striven to unify it on an international scale. The beginnings were made in 1864 in London by the First International. The Franco-Prussian War, out of which emerged the Germany of the Hohenzollerns, cut the ground from under the First International and at the same time gave impetus to the development of national workers' parties. As far back as 1889, these parties came together in the Congress of Paris and created the organization of the Second International. But the center of gravity of the labor movement during that period remained wholly on national soil, wholly within the framework of national states, upon the foundation of national industry, within the sphere of national parliamentarism. The decades of reformist organizational activity gave birth to an entire generation of leaders, the majority of whom recognized in words the program of the social revolution, but renounced it in deeds, becoming mired in reformism and a docile adaptation to the bourgeois state. The opportunist character of the leading parties of the Second International has been completely disclosed, and it led to the greatest collapse in world history in a moment when the march of historic events demanded revolutionary methods of struggle from the working class parties. If the War of 1870 dealt a blow to the First International, disclosing that there was as yet no fused mass force behind its social revolutionary program, then the War of 1914 killed the Second International, disclosing that the mightiest organizations of the working masses were dominated by parties which had become transformed into auxiliary organs of the bourgeois state. Now, in fact, as events in the German Revolution would prove, the social democracy, after years of focusing on parliamentary politics and intrigue, in fact, it became enmeshed in the bourgeois state and became a key pillar, in fact, in the defense of the ruling class and capitalism itself. So there had already been calls to establish a new international by September of 1914, so a month after the First World War started. But the forces of revolutionary socialism were quite isolated, quite small. The famous Zimmerwald Conference took place in September 1915, so more or less a year after the war started. And this was a gathering really of the left wing of the Second International. And Trotsky once remarked that the delegates themselves joked about the fact that half a century after the founding of the First International, it was still possible to seat all the internationalists in 4 stagecoaches. I think there was about 40 delegates to this conference. But the future Communist International would emerge from the left wing of the Zimmerwald Conference. So after the First World War, there was this revolutionary wave that I mentioned, and there was a radicalization of the masses to the left that was taking place almost everywhere. And strong communist revolutionary currents were growing within the working class movement everywhere. And this wave of revolutions was reflected in the composition of the first Congress of the Communist, or the Third International. A total of 39 groups were invited, with 15 of these groups originating inside the old Second International. And I think it's important that we understand that the Communist International was not some sort of homogenous bloc. It included the whole of the Italian Socialist Party, which included some reformist elements. It included ultra-left elements from Germany, the Netherlands, and Britain, as well as anarcho-syndicalists from France, the UK, and the United States, including representatives from the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And so this was really an attempt to gather together all the revolutionary currents and tendencies within the international workers' movement, from the left wings of the socialist parties to the revolutionary groups that had stood outside of the Second International. And the Communist International also consciously opened up to groups in the colonial countries as well, China, India, and so on. And this was something that the Second International had actually neglected, and they focused mainly on the more advanced countries in Europe. So when it was founded, the Communist International, or the Comintern, was made up of mainly small groups with inexperienced leadership. But by 1921, it had spread more or less across the globe and had gathered hundreds of thousands of members around it. Mass communist parties were formed or in the process of formation in Germany, France, and Italy. And communist parties made important advances in the labor movement in Great Britain, Canada, and elsewhere. I think when the Communist Party of Canada was formed, it managed to group together about 90% of the activists in the labor movement, which is quite impressive. I don't think something like that was done anywhere else, actually. The Communist International and the debates and resolutions, all the theses and the manifestos issued during these first four congresses dealt with all the key questions ranging from trade union tactics, United Front, the ultra-left tactics, work amongst women, the youth, and so on. And I think it's important to highlight that the Communist International, at least for these first four congresses, was a genuinely democratic organization. I mean, it continued to meet, to discuss, to debate, votes were taken on decisions. It did all of this even during the Russian Civil War. And for several congresses during the Russian Civil War, Trotsky himself would travel to Moscow from the front to participate in the discussions, and then he'd go back to the front to continue the fight against the whites, which also shows you how important the Bolsheviks actually considered the International to be. Now, there's a firm dividing line between the first four congresses, which were genuine democratic discussions, proceedings of a Marxist organization, and the last three congresses, which were exercises in the Stalinist school of falsification. During the first four congresses, unlike those last three, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the positions of the leadership, the positions of Lenin and Trotsky, for example, would be adopted by the Congress. For example, on the question of the United Front, Lenin and Trotsky started out in a minority, and in fact, they were considered the right wing of the Congress by many of the delegates. The leadership had to argue its case, and it was only through democratic debate and the power of their ideas and arguments that over the course of the Congress, Lenin and Trotsky were able to win over the majority of the delegates to their position. And I think this fact alone serves to highlight the democratic nature of the Commune during these first four Congresses. Different opinions were expressed openly, and there was no fear of being ostracized, expelled, or jailed, or killed, or anything like that, as would become the norm in the later years under the Stalinist regime. But after Lenin's death, and once the bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union had set in, the Stalinist bureaucracy proceeded to basically revise the revolutionary heritage of the first four Congresses of the Comintern. And they really reverted to basically reformist ideas, particularly the Menshevik idea of stages, or what we often call the two-stage theory. Now, according to this theory, in the economically backward countries, the working class could not proceed directly to the socialist transformation of society. According to this theory, what was required was first a bourgeois revolution, which would then open up a long period of capitalist development, and only at a much later stage would the conditions emerge for socialist revolution. Now, this runs directly contrary to the actual lessons, the actual experience of the Russian Revolution itself, where the working class in a backward country came to power and expropriated the capitalists. Now, there's abundant evidence to the fact that, contrary to what the Stalinists would have us believe, all the deliberations of the first four Congresses of the Communist International, the speeches, the resolutions, and so on, they contradict everything that was later elaborated by Stalin and his cronies. Lenin and Trotsky understood that socialism in one backward country was not possible, that the only way the Russian Revolution could have survived on a healthy basis would have been by spreading the revolution to more advanced capitalist countries. And this was the main aim of the Communist International. Then, if that had happened, then the technique and the human resources of these countries could have enormously accelerated the economic development of the Soviet Union. And this would have strengthened the position of the working class and laid the conditions that would have avoided the very rise of the bureaucracy that was taking place in the Soviet Union. So building the International wasn't just a little bit of fun or some sort of extra add-on thing for Lenin and Trotsky to do, but they considered it an essential part of building the new world socialist society. They considered it an urgent task to spread the revolution. In fact, Lenin at one point said that the workers of Russia would gladly sacrifice the Soviet Union if it meant that the German Revolution would succeed. And building this international was no utopian dream, but it was actually rooted in the objective situation of the period. Trotsky himself played a central role in the proceedings of these first four congresses. The first edition of this book, which we've just republished, was actually originally published in the Soviet Union in Russian in 1924 by the State Publishing House in Moscow. I think the fact that the official publishing house in 1924, when the fight against Trotsky by Stalin was already starting, the fact that it was published there and that they published all of Trotsky's main contributions to the Congresses, I think that's testimony to the fact that Trotsky's role was actually recognized openly. The process of degeneration was only at its very early beginnings, and it was only years later that this book and all of Trotsky's other writings would disappear from the Soviet Union. But despite the gigantic efforts of Lenin and Trotsky, together with other leaders of the Communist International, the tremendous revolutionary opportunities that existed in one country after another were lost. The communist parties came into being too late, frankly, and often with a leadership that had not been tested by time and experience. And looking back, an opportunity to change the world was lost, and as a consequence, humanity paid a very heavy price for that failure with the tragic events of the rise of Italian and German fascism and the whole thing that led up to the outbreak of the Second World War. The Communist International and these debates and resolutions from the first four congresses dealt with all these key questions that I've already mentioned, and had the Comintern not abandoned all these lessons from these first four congresses, all would not have necessarily been lost. There was a new crisis that erupted in 1929 following the Great Depression of the 1930s. And other great events took place in this period too. The British General Strike, the Chinese Revolution, events in Germany. And in Germany, there were multiple opportunities for successful revolution. And then going into the 1930s, you had mass movements and mass strikes in France. You had the sit-down strikes in the United States. You had the Civil War in Spain. So there were still all sorts of revolutionary opportunities throughout this period. And had the communist parties basically stuck to the principles or applied the lessons of the first four congresses, in the 20s and the 1930s, they still could have successfully led the working class of Germany, France, and Spain to power, and in other countries as well. And this would have radically transformed the whole world situation and would have changed world history forever. But by the end of the 1920s, the Stalinist faction of the party, and eventually the International, after they expelled Trotsky and the left opposition, they gained full control of the Communist International, and they carried a complete about-face in its analysis and its slogans, its tactics, and so on. And this is very clear in relation to the question of the United Front, on the question of fascism, on the question of socialist revolution in a backwards country, and so on. And the real problem was that the Communist International was born and was still a young organization when the bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union began to take place. And I think the question we have to ask is why the leadership of the Communist International under Stalin abandoned all of these lessons. And the answer to that is partially in the caliber of the leadership after Lenin's death in 1924. It's also partially related to the desire of these bureaucrats to isolate and remove Trotsky. As each revolution in other countries was defeated, as capitalism found a temporary restabilization, the prospect of world revolution began to recede somewhat. And this process of bureaucratic degeneration unfolded in the Soviet Union, and it eventually destroyed genuine workers' democracy, destroyed the Bolshevik Party, and it destroyed the Communist International. In this process, a privileged bureaucracy consolidated its position at the top of society. And it was Stalin who became the living embodiment of that process. Once it had consolidated its position, that bureaucratic caste proceeded to eliminate all the healthy elements within the Bolshevik Party, transformed it from a genuine revolutionary party of the working class into a tool for the defense of a bureaucratic privilege. And in order to do this, the Stalinists had to eradicate not only the memory of the party, but physically annihilate the party itself. So Lenin could be removed as a figure, but Lenin could not be removed as a figure, but they could hide and distort his ideas. Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, and other leaders would eventually be physically eliminated by Stalin, in spite of the fact that they had capitulated to him and confessed to crimes that they'd never committed. But there was one Bolshevik leader who didn't capitulate, and he continued to defend these ideas, and that was Trotsky. So once these ideas were abandoned, the leadership under Stalin lost all its bearings, as political positions were no longer designed to further the revolutionary interests of the world working class, but were designed to protect the interests of the bureaucratic clique that had usurped power in the Soviet Union. The Comintern was transformed from a revolutionary organization fighting for the interests of the world working class into a pawn in the diplomatic maneuvers of the Soviet Union. This was seen in the swing towards an opportunist position in Britain and China in the 1920s. And in the Soviet Union, the bureaucracy was following a policy of collaboration with the kulaks, or the rich peasants, and the NEP men, which were basically middlemen that had emerged and become powerful following the opening of market relations in the countryside. And so, because they were following a policy of class collaboration in the Soviet Union, they followed a policy of class collaboration elsewhere, in China and so on. And this led to the defeat of the revolution and the slaughtering of the Communist Party. After this, when the Soviet Union was in danger due to rising capitalist relations in the countryside and facing danger from the kulaks, from the rich peasants, the Stalinists swung wildly to ultra-left positions of the third period in 1928, which declared basically everything except themselves to be fascist, including the social democracy. And this policy prevented the working class of Germany from uniting in the fight against Hitler and allowed the Nazis to come to power in 1933. When this policy failed and the Soviet Union was looking for allies in France, Great Britain, and the United States against a rearming in fascist Germany, the Stalinist bureaucracy passed then over to a policy of the Popular Front and open class collaboration with the so-called progressive bourgeoisie. This basically submerged the workers into alliances with bourgeois parties and led directly to the defeat of the Spanish workers in the Spanish Civil War. And at this point in this process, the Communist International is then transformed from a diplomatic pawn in the hands of Stalin into an active counter-revolutionary force, holding back the working class from taking power at key moments. Now, in terms of sort of why this happened, why Trotsky lost this fight that was taking place in the Soviet Union, I think we have to understand that it's not just a fight between individuals, but it's a struggle between living social forces. Stalin was representing the interests of the bureaucracy and the petty bourgeois layers, the rich peasants and these NEP men I mentioned. And Trotsky was representing the traditions of October and was basing himself on the revolutionary working class and youth. But the Russian Revolution was isolated, and the working class was tired and smashed after years of war, revolution, and civil war. And so the bureaucracy was able to gain the upper hand. Now, in the Soviet Union, you had this problem of the specialists. Most people in Russia at the time of the revolution were illiterate, and it was very difficult for the working class to organize the economy on its own. So they came to rely on old czarist bureaucrats and the intelligentsia, people who could read, basically, to help organize the economy. And these specialists demanded a lot of concessions, nicer houses, higher wages, and these concessions continued to grow. And by a certain point in early 1922, these specialists actually outnumbered workers in the Soviet Communist Party. And then when the International Revolution appeared to have failed, they basically saw all this talk of international revolution as troublesome, as a bother. And they really just wanted to settle down and enjoy the privileges of their position. And this is where socialism in one country comes from, this idea of socialism in one country. And many of the communist parties in the Comintern were relatively new, with inexperienced leadership and members. And they'd seen the results of Bolshevism, and they were inspired by the Russian Revolution, but they hadn't necessarily seen all the years of struggle, and they hadn't seen how the Bolshevik Party had learned all of its lessons. And they themselves didn't have years of struggle behind them to prepare the leadership on how to lead the working class to power, like the Bolshevik Party had. And they didn't necessarily understand the methods of Bolshevism or the methods of Leninism. And the Soviet Party and the leadership had enormous prestige because they had a successful revolution. They had state power, so everybody looked up to them. And so one by one, the communist parties of the International fell victim to these Stalinist intrigues. And many of the communist parties never recovered from the third period policies. And there was always, it seems, some self-serving bureaucrat looking to looking to increase their prestige, who was ready to take the reins of these parties and take charge in exchange for total submission to Moscow. So in the end, the Communist International ended up in a swamp of class collaboration, just like the Second International before it. And this was finally confirmed when Stalin simply dissolved it in 1943. And there wasn't any discussion or any debate. It was simply a directive that was sent out to all the communist parties. It was simply an order. And again, this served the foreign policy and the diplomatic interests of Stalin and the bureaucracy, not the interests of the international working class. Basically, in the talks between the Allies towards the end of the war, Churchill and Roosevelt were a bit concerned that Stalin had this international communist organization, which could be used to cause some problems in Allied countries. So in exchange for military aid, they demanded that he get rid of it. And so he did. He just wrote a letter and shut the thing down. So as mentioned, when Hitler came to power in 1933, with no real opposition from the working class or the Communist Party, like Hitler even boasted that he came to power and not even a window pane was broken. And when the Nazis came to power, the Communist Party of Germany actually said, well, the fascists have won, but next time it'll be our turn. Well, there was no next time. The workers' movement was utterly smashed in Nazi Germany, and many of the first victims were precisely the leaders of the communist and the socialist parties. Now, Trotsky considered this a betrayal by the Communist International on the order of the betrayal of the Second International at the start of the First World War. Comintern policies led directly to the rise of Hitler in Germany, and afterwards there was no effort to learn the lessons of this defeat. So Trotsky began to work towards the establishment of a new Fourth International. But unfortunately, the groups around Trotsky were quite small. They were quite isolated. Many of these groups had some confusions. They were disoriented with all the events that were taking place, and many of them made some sectarian mistakes. And overall, this kind of reflected the isolation of the Trotskyists from the mass movement. They were kind of stuck between these mighty forces of reformism, Stalinism, and fascism, and all the great events that were taking place. But in the end, the Fourth International was launched in 1938 on the basis of a definite perspective of a revolutionary upswing following World War II. Unfortunately, this perspective was falsified by history. After the war, the revolutionary wave that Trotsky expected, it did take place, but Stalinism and reformism were enormously strengthened after the war, not weakened as he expected. And then, of course, the assassination of Trotsky by a Stalinist agent in 1940 was a fatal blow to the Fourth and its leadership, and it basically never recovered from this. The other leaders of the Fourth proved unequal to the tasks posed by history, and they ended up really just repeating the words of Trotsky verbatim without understanding the method behind what he was saying. And in the end, they ended up not capable of understanding the new situation that arose after 1945. As a result, they made serious errors, which led to the shipwreck of the Fourth in the 1940s, 1950s, and really the breaking up and the splintering of the Trotskyist movement, the source of all the jokes about how Trotskyists like to split and all that kind of stuff. The root of all of that is in this period after the Second World War in the late 1940s. And really today, the Fourth International doesn't really exist as an organization. There are actually quite a few groups that try to speak in its name or claim its heritage, but really to one way or another, all these groups have abandoned Marxism. Some have openly abandoned Marxism, but others have really just descended into being virulent and irritating sects. During the long post-war upswing from the mid-1940s until the mid-1970s, the forces of Marxism were isolated even further, and reformism and Stalinism were strengthened. And the situation is such that today, some 150 years after the founding of the First International, the revolutionary movement has been thrown way, way back, and the forces of genuine Marxism have been reduced to a tiny minority in the labor movement. But there's an essential contradiction here. In terms of the working class, it's actually stronger than ever. It's bigger and more powerful than any time in history. Yet the revolutionary wing of the workers' movement has been thrown way, way back, almost to a situation similar to the very beginnings of the workers' movement, or isolated, like the Zimmerwald lefts after at the start of World War I. Decades of economic growth in the advanced capitalist countries have given rise to an unprecedented degeneration of the mass organizations of the working class. The Second International actually still exists to this day, but the social democrats of today are really left liberals, or not even really left liberals, just liberals. And they don't frankly hold a candle to the social democrats of the past, who at least paid lip service to socialism. The task we are confronted with is roughly analogous to that Marx and Engels faced at the time of the founding of the First International. For decades, Marx and Engels were forced to swim against the stream, which is basically what we've been doing for decades as well. But the global economic crisis from 10 years ago and the one that we're going through right now, these are marking key turning points in the world situation. And the strategists of capital, the ruling class, they can't see any way out of it. The crisis of capitalism is provoking a reaction on the part of the workers and the youth, and we've seen mass movements erupt in country after country, some with insurrectionary implications, including even in the United States. Now it seems we're actually swimming with the stream. People are increasingly interested in socialism and the ideas of Marxism, yet no genuine mass revolutionary international exists at the present time. The central problem can be simply stated. It's a problem of leadership. In 1938, Leon Trotsky stated that the crisis of humanity can be reduced to the crisis of the proletarian leadership. This completely sums up the present situation today as well. And it's a bit of an irony of history that the leaders of the mass workers' parties are kind of clinging on to this decrepit capitalist system and the market system, even when it's collapsing around their ears. The workers and youth have done everything in their power to change society, but they can find no organized expression for their efforts. At every step, they find their path blocked by the old bureaucratic organizations and leaderships that have long ago abandoned any pretense to stand for socialism. So we have to understand that the International will not be built merely by proclaiming it. We can't just say, we've built the Revolutionary International, come join us. It will be built on the basis of events, just like the Communist International was built on the basis of the events in the stormy period of 1914 to 1920. Great events are necessary to educate the masses in the necessity of a revolutionary transformation of society. But along with events, we also need to create an organization with clear ideas and solid roots in the masses on a world scale. Our task is to participate in the class struggle shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the class, to go through all the experiences at every juncture, and to explain the need for the socialist transformation of society. It's only by winning first the most active and conscious elements of the proletarian vanguard and the youth that it will be possible to reach the masses who still remain under the influence of various reformist organizations. Lenin always said, patiently explain, especially when the Bolsheviks were in a minority, and this is something that we should really take to heart and follow. What we need is a revolutionary international that is capable of giving an organized expression and political guidance to this struggle against capitalism. From small beginnings, actually a couple of different small beginnings over the decades, the IMT, our organization, the International Marxist Tendency, we're now working in, I think, something like 40 countries. Brazil, the United States, Canada, Greece, Venezuela, Mexico, Britain, France, Pakistan. And we've achieved quite a bit, actually, especially in the last couple of years even, but it's only the beginning. In a certain sense, history's come full circle. After the long recovery, the big upswing after the Second World War, the capitalist system is today facing the deepest crisis it has ever faced. And this crisis is preparing revolutionary convulsions on a scale never before seen in history, such as what we just saw in the United States this summer. The task facing us is still the same as what was said in the Manifesto of the First Congress of the Communist International. The building of a force that can end the capitalist system once and for all. The IMT's political and organizational principles, our ideas, our traditions, are those of Marx and Engels in the First International, of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, the first four Congresses of the Third International, the ideas and traditions established by Trotsky and the International Left Opposition, and the founding Congress of the Fourth International, as well as the ideas that we've developed over the last 70 years. This is what we claim as our heritage. And on that basis, we appeal to every worker, every student, all the youth who agree with this aim to help us achieve our final goal, the victory of international socialism. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Rob. As we digitally hail you with claps from afar, it was a really nice speech. Thank you so much. I learned quite a few things, and I hope everyone else here did too. There's a little bit of ado. Before we go into our discussion about what Rob said, maybe what Rob didn't say, what questions people have, what people want to talk about, we will have this discussion period very soon. I just have a couple quick announcements first, a couple quick things to say. So first of all, I'll just repeat what I said again. I've only read the introduction and skimmed through this book, but so far, it's really cool. And the introduction is brand new. It's written in 2020. And so, this sort of parallel between 1920 and 2020 is quite clear there. Our comrade in Britain wrote the intro to this along with the material printed here. So if you want a copy of this book, this big old red thing looks cool on your bookshelf and has lots of great lessons like Rob was talking about, you can just find that on our website, marxist.ca/books, I think. And I'm sure that link will get posted soon. So you can find that. And if you're in an area like where we have a branch, we might have physical copies there that you can buy directly, or you are always able to order them on the website so that they get shipped to you at your leisure. So that's the book. There's a couple other things to talk about too. We have more than this book. We have several other books as well. We reprint old material, like we have this republication of old lessons. We also write books all the time ourselves, and we have a series of classics from Marx and Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, and others, to lots of other people that you might not have heard of, but maybe you have, and you can go find a book of them. And we write our own books as well, like I said. So again, bringing a Marxist analysis to the world political situation throughout history, throughout current events. We've got a book about it probably. So you can check that out in our bookstore. I encourage you to do so, especially the holidays are coming up. Maybe if you're a student, exams are going to be done soon. Maybe, actually, this is something I forgot to say, is we have gift cards. We have gift card options too. So if there's someone you know in your life who would like to have books, but you don't know what exactly they want, they can get a gift card at our bookstore. I believe the link is in the same link. I believe it's a header on that website somewhere. You can get a gift card for a loved one to read some Marxist theory and prepare for 2021 with a even sharper revolutionary edge to their thought and ideas. So that's that. I'd also like to tell you about books are great. They're a little long. We also print, articles about the current events, history, theory, and we publish them on a monthly basis in a magazine. So we publish in French because we're in Canada. We are part of our sister organization, La Riposte Socialiste. We publish in French. So if you're interested in brushing up on your French, or if you are bilingual, you can check that out. It's great. Also published monthly is our English paper. So we write articles all the time, and they're awesome. It is the best Marxist analysis that I think you will get in Canada. It's a lot better than Jacobin, and it's a lot cheaper too. So if you like Jacobin, maybe you'll like this a little better, and you can save some money as well. So, and we got these nice pretty covers. So that's our paper that we make, where we, hone our analysis of the situation. We invite people to come join us doing that. Like I said earlier, if you are interested in getting involved in Fight Back, you can follow these same links. Get in touch with someone in a branch closest to you, whether that's in Montreal or another city in Canada, in Medicine Hat, I don't know. There's a bunch of them. Or, anywhere else in the world. We've got branches in most places now. So I'm sure you can find someone near you if you follow those links. Now, for our discussion period. So I'll just bring up again in case you missed it. To facilitate discussion, I will be chairing, so I will be unmuting people when you raise your hand. If you want to raise your hand to get in on the conversation, we encourage as many people to get in on these conversations. Like Rob was talking about, we have and celebrate a democratic tradition. If you disagree with us, if you don't understand what the heck anyone said, if you have something else entirely, well, try to keep it relevant. I ask you that. But you can raise your hand. You're welcome to. I will only, use my chair privileges if you're a fascist and a troll. Then I'll kick you. I have no qualms about doing that. But if you're just any person, that's fine. We're here to ask questions and learn and discuss. And so this is a great platform to do that. So if you want to do this, you go to the participants menu in Zoom. You can hit a raise hand button. I ask you, if you want to get in on the speakers list, please get your hands. I don't see anyone's hands up yet. So get your hand up if you want to talk. And I will get you on a speakers list, and we'll go through and we'll have a nice discussion. Just a couple more notes about this. If you want to participate in the discussion, please turn on your webcam. This just verifies that you're a real person and we can have a real conversation. It feels more wholesome and genuine, get to know each other, and etc. So please turn on your webcam. And another favor I'd ask too, you can rename yourself in Zoom. You can see I have MTL, stands for Montreal, so I'm coming at you from Montreal. Wherever you are today, if you add your name to your Zoom information there, it gives us a sense of where everyone's coming from, and then it makes it much easier to get in touch in case you want to get involved, in case you have any questions. I believe I have said everything that I want to say. I'm seeing a couple hands raising. I would like to invite more people to speak. If you, again, have a question, have a disagreement, anything that you want to know, challenge us. We have quite a few people in this chat who know tons of stuff and who would be happy to answer you if you have any question. No question is too silly. Well, I guess there are some questions that are silly, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Give it a shot. I'm sure someone would be interested in hearing about it. So if you have a question, I'm sure tons of other people in the chat do too. So without further ado, I'll get things started with sorry if I pronounce this or anybody's name wrong. Feel free to correct me. It's Didier Chalin. I will get to you in a second, and I'll unmute you when I find you. There you are. Okay, Didier, whenever you're ready, I'm trying to unmute you.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, so I'm going to start. I had two questions today, but I'm going to start with the first one. So, with the Trump situation and the whole Trump and Biden situation, America has never been more divided than it currently is. And so I was looking at all the writings that Trotsky wrote about fascism and what is it and how to fight it. And why it's relevant at this moment is that his main basic idea is that it's wrong in a time of fascism not to make alliances with some social democratic parties, even though ordinarily we don't want to make alliances, or at least we want to be cautious about making alliances with them because they're reformists, and so we're revolutionaries. We don't want to get Bursteinian. But in times of fascist domination, we need to be aware of being sectarian and not making alliances with social democratic parties. So in light of the division of American society at this moment, in the light of the fact that Bernie Sanders is gone, at least he's no longer as relevant as he used to, how should we react in good Trotskyian fashion to the current situation, since we know basically that this could not just stay in the US, it could also go into Canada, because there's already some proto-fascist tendencies in Canada. There's other proto-fascist tendencies in France. So basically, the fact that it's so divided in the US could make it a global phenomenon before long. So how do we respond? Do we form an alliance with Biden because of the fascist menace? So that's my first question. The second question, I was totally wrong about the topic of the meeting today. I thought actually it was a history of the international Marxist tendency. So I read a lot about it and I had questions about it. So if you think it's not relevant, don't answer it. But there seems to be in the history of someone like Ted Grant a basic effort to not become opportunist, to steer clear of opportunism, but also to steer clear of what has been called ultra-leftism or sectarianism. And for instance, by Peter Taft in the British movement in 1991 was accused of ultra-leftism for precisely abandoning the Labour Party. So I was wondering, what would you consider ultra-leftist? What would be an ultra-leftist tendency that we could avoid at this moment? So that were my two questions.
Cool. Thanks, Didier. Yeah, great start for the discussion here. If you have questions like this, or even questions, any kind of questions, these are great and a good start for the discussion. It does remind me of one quick thing. First, I'll appeal. If you have raised your hand already, I've put you down on the speakers list. Don't worry, I'll get you to you. But I would like to see more people get in on this. So if you haven't raised your hand yet and you have a question, maybe you've been thinking about it simmering, this Trump-Biden discussion, this fascism discussion, this stuff about international communist internationals, what does that mean? If it's simmering on a question, I invite you to come in. Please raise your hand. I will get you on the speakers list, and I promise everyone will be nice. If someone's not nice, I will make sure that they are nice. That's my job. So don't worry about that. Please ask questions. I will mark you down on my speakers list. One thing Didier brought up that I was reminded of is our sister organization in the United States is holding a school on questions similar to what he was asking with the election that just happened, an analysis of it and other perspectives. That I believe, I don't have a link handy right now, but I believe that's taking place on November 15th, 14th. It's a weekend event with talks and discussions like this. So if you are interested in hearing from our comrades in the United States, please give that a look. I believe links will be shared about that. Hopefully some link magic will happen. So I don't see anyone else on the speakers list. I will move on to the next speaker, but if you are sitting there thinking like, oh, I don't know if I should ask that, you probably should, because maybe someone else is wondering too. So I will go next with Christina. So I will unmute you here.
Hi. So I was planning to talk about ultra-leftism for a bit anyway, so this is relevant, I guess, to what Didier was asking about. Yes, so, one of the, Rob mentioned this in his talks, one of the things that Lenin and Trotsky had to fight against in the Third International was a tendency for these new communists to be ultra-left. The Russian Revolution had enthused workers and socialists and communists around the world, and a lot of young people, and were all about for revolution, and that's all they saw when they looked at Russia, and they hadn't seen the years of patient work that the Bolsheviks had put in leading up to that revolution to build those links with the masses, so that when the revolution happened, they'd actually, have some authority and be listened to. That long patient work included working in mass organizations, workers' organizations. And Lenin and Trotsky stressed the need for revolutionaries to establish close links to the mass organizations and especially to unions. In Russia, what this looked like was the Bolsheviks doing work in workers' organizations of all kinds, even in yellow unions that had been set up by the police, because that's where they were going to go meet workers. Elsewhere in the world, this looks like doing work in unions even that have opportunist and class collaborationist leaders, as opposed to breaking off into trying to start a radical union or a red union. This also means working in labor parties that have a mass base in the working class. So Lenin and Trotsky, for example, advised the British communists in the 1920s to affiliate with the Labour Party there and to join the Labour Party, because that's where they were going to go and find workers that they could actually talk to and win over. And this is especially relevant, I think, to the present situation. When you have the British Labour Party, the leadership and bureaucracy, coming at suspending Corbyn, and all the other absolutely horrible way the bureaucracy has conducted itself, sabotaging the election for Labour. Really, you have a lot of leftists in Britain being very demoralized and saying that they should just leave Labour and forget it, start a new party, start something else. And that would be a sectarian thing to do at this point. That splitting off and forming a more radical party when and doing that, it would mean leaving the masses of the workers to the mercy of the reformist bureaucrats in the old party, without the benefit of having the presence of real socialists there to argue the case for socialism and to put up a real fight for the working class. I think that's all I wanted to say on this. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Christina. Hopefully that gets at part of the question you're answering there, Didier. If you have people have follow-up questions, follow-up things to say, that's invited as well. So I have a couple more people on the speakers list. Just a quick note here. When you raise your hand, I will be lowering it after you. So if you have raised your hand and then it goes down, I've seen it. I've taken a pen note. So I've seen that you have to ask the question. So no worries. You're up on the list. I'll add one or two more people here. If you haven't raised your hand yet, please do get in on that list before it's too late. But next, I will have Greg speak.
Okay. So I guess this is sort of a response. I was initially going to say this was a response to the previous person who spoke, but I guess this also kind of goes with Christina. This summer I read kind of an interesting book by Eric Hoffer called The True Believer. To one extent or another, you can say it's kind of a centrist book, but I don't know. It kind of gives more of like a unbiased analysis on both the far left and the far right. And it was written in the 50s. And one thing he said in the book that really struck me was like, and I noticed a lot of leftists kind of bring this up, is like before World War II, what like the reason why a lot of centrists and liberals were more in favor of the Nazi Party than they were of any kind of left wing, anything that could be sympathetic towards the left wing, is mainly because they didn't want another communist revolution to happen in Germany. And that's why a lot of business, like people in business started trading with Hitler, and there was kind of that support until things became too late, and that's why the war happened and so on. The argument Offer makes is that, like, from a centrist perspective, like if you try to help too much of one side, you end up having to kind of like you have to ally and fight with the other. And in this sense, like, I feel like a lot of centrists are really unaware of this, like extremely unaware, which in my opinion, actually, we can use that to our advantage. Which is kind of why, like, with a Biden victory, in my opinion, obviously this isn't gonna lead anything remotely close to what we want, and in some cases even put us back. But I also kind of can't help but think that it's like when Trump was in power, it's kind of like everyone was a bit of the liberal, getting kind of the far left to sort of like fight against the remaining far right that a lot of do-nothing liberals like Biden is going to pretty much ignore after coming into power. I really think will accelerate us a lot more. And it's also kind of good to sort of use centrists to our advantage, just like, you know, the far right has. And yeah, that's kind of my stance.
All right, interesting. Thanks, Greg. I will pass it off to the next person I have on my list here. One thing I'd like to say first is I would like to see some more hands up. So if you won't do it out of genuine curiosity, maybe you'll do it out of a little bit social pressure. I'd like to see some more people get in on this discussion. You know, not all of us here are experts on communist internationals. We haven't seen one in our life for a long time. So I encourage anything. Like, what would be the role? What should be the role of people who call themselves communists, revolutionaries in the current crisis that we see today? Maybe something like that, you know, kind of these kind of questions. Get your mind whirring a little bit. So I'd like to see some hands up. I do have a couple people here next on the speakers list, but I will just make that appeal. You can, if you haven't already seen this, if you click on the manage participant, no, that's on my view. The participants button. There is a participants button. You can raise your hand and I will see it and I'll get you in here. And then we'll have it's always nice to hear from more people, hear from people we haven't heard from, all that kind of stuff. So really, I encourage you to get in, and I'm seeing some people come in, so that's great. So keep your mind whirring, keep some questions going, listen to what people are saying. Let's talk it out. So next on my speakers list, I have Moral from Toronto. So Moral, if you're ready, I'm going to unmute you. Oh, I'm going to unmute you and then accidentally mute you again. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on Didier's question about fascism. So DDA was asking about Trotsky and the Marxist approach to fighting fascism. And our approach is the United Front, right? So according to the United Front tactic, the idea is that when there is a fascist threat, all of the organizations of the working class should work together to fight off that threat. So whether we are anarchists, Marxists, reformists, we should all come together and work together to fight the common threat of fascism. So in Germany, as Rob mentioned in the leadoff, when there was an immediate threat of fascism coming to power, the Stalinists in Germany, the KPD there, refused to work with the Social Democrats, right? In the late 1920s, the Comintern was going through the third period. And this was a time when they were basically saying that everyone other than themselves is fascist. So when real fascism was on the order of the day, they were looking at the Social Democrats in Germany and saying, well, they're fascists too. Those are the social fascists. And they did not work with them to fight fascism. So it was actually the Stalinists in that period that refused to work with the Social Democrats. In his article, The Fascist Danger Looms in Germany, Trotsky actually criticizes the Stalinists for not working together with the Social Democrats to prevent the victory of fascism in Germany, because if they were to combine their efforts, they could have stopped it. What we are opposed to is this idea of a popular front. So while a united front is when the workers' organizations work together to fight the fascist threat, a popular front is when you work together with the supposedly good bourgeois, right? So essentially, among the capitalists, there might be a layer that do not support fascism, and the workers' organizations essentially have a policy of class collaboration. That's what Trotsky opposed. And as Marxists, we oppose that in all instances, including in the United States. Class collaboration is never the answer. This has been proven historically. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but in the example of Germany, for example, in the elections in 1929, I believe, there was a guy who was running named Hindenburg, and he was seen as like the candidate who had the best chance of defeating Hitler. And in order to defeat Hitler, a lot of people voted for Hindenburg, and he was like a conservative. And Hindenburg won that election. But then a couple years later, it was Hindenburg, the guy who was supposedly going to stop fascism from coming to power, who appointed Hitler as chancellor. So fascism does not come from the ballot box, and it cannot be defeated through the ballot box either. So in terms of fighting Trump and fighting fascism in the US, I think it's really important to make it clear that we don't consider Trump a fascist. He's racist, he's sexist, he's a bastard, but that doesn't make him a fascist. Fascism is not defined by a laundry list of characteristics. Fascism is actually a social phenomenon, and it's part of a larger process. And this was covered in a previous leadoff at the university, so I'm not going to cover what that is, but we don't consider Trump to be a fascist. Although many of his supporters are fascists, and Trump has really emboldened the fascist elements in the country. His base is dangerous. We can see that with a lot of these like lunatics that have gone on these shooting sprees. The far right is clearly emboldened right now, and that is a real threat. But in terms of how we fight that, how we fight Trump's base, if Biden is going to win this election, which is looking likely at this point, Trump's base is not going away. All of the conditions that led to Trump winning still exist, and they're actually getting worse, right? Where did Trump's base come from? It came from the fact that capitalism is in crisis. A lot of people see these problems, and there's no socialist solutions being put forward to their problems. So they're falling into Trumpism, essentially, to solve their problems, which is totally wrong, and it has no solutions to offer them. But that's all they're being offered right now is liberalism, more of the same, the status quo, and whatever the fuck Trump is saying. Because he's saying, things are fucked up, we have to fix them, and he's channeling their anger. So if we want to actually defeat the fascist threat, the first thing we'd have to do is to actually offer inspiring solutions. You don't beat fascism with liberalism. It's never worked. Like, there's no precedent in history of liberalism working against fascism. The only thing that can actually fight them is the organized working class. And a good historical example of how you can fight fascism would be the Battle of Cable Street in Britain. where the fascists were intending to march through a Jewish neighborhood under the leadership of Mosley. And then all of the workers showed up and they beat the shit out of the fascists. And after that, the British fascists were massively weakened and scared. So how you actually fight these people is by organizing the working class and mobilizing it, not only against the fascist threat, but also on an inspiring program, right? You can't just be talking about what you're against, but also you have to be for something. That's the only way to actually fight. So in the US right now, what we're doing is we did not endorse Biden. We were very clear that that Obama paved the way for Trump, right? That it was liberalism and the crisis of capitalism that paved the way for this sort of politics. And that what's needed is a workers' organization in the US, specifically a socialist organization. I think something like 68% of Americans said that they're willing to vote for a socialist. So under these sorts of conditions, when what we saw over the summer is basically the beginnings of a new American revolution, there's no reason working class people in the US should have to settle for more of the same. And the fact that Biden is probably going to win by a very narrow majority shows that even though Trump basically under his watch, 250,000 people died, despite all of Trump's failures, people did not come out in droves to support Biden because they're sick of more of the same. They're looking for something radically different.
Well, sorry to cut you off here. Oh, maybe that was it. Sorry, I didn't start my timer, but you're probably pushing so if you could wrap it up, but thanks. Oh, no, you're muted. Maybe I came in at the end and cut you off anticlimactically. Sorry about that. I will try to be sharper about the time here going forward, just so everyone can get in. Thank you very much, Meraldo. That was super interesting. But just so everyone can get in on the conversation, I'm going to limit you guys to around 4 minutes. I might make it shorter as we go along. But thanks again, Meraldo. That was awesome. So next on my speakers list, we have a couple more people. Let me find. So next I have Peter Barriston and Rob W. And after that, the speakers list is wide open. So please raise that hand. Anything that people said that you found interesting that you want to come in on. Actually, a lot of the stuff that Maral was talking about is in this book. This question, like, what is a popular front? What is a united front? I think she explained it in pretty good detail, but if you want more, this is talked about and debated in detail. These are questions that have been around for a long time for the response to things like fascism. At the time of this book, fascism was developing in Italy, and now we have this question of what to do about it today. So, great source of information there. Now, without further ado, I will bring Peter into the conversation. Peter, you are unmuted if you're ready to go.
Yeah. So since I was literally begged to participate, I am going to go cheap and easy, though. So this question comes up a lot when I'm talking to most people I know who are centrists or liberals. The question of how people only work to further their own interests, which a lot of scholarship has disproven. But it's also, some scholarship has shown that the more you accumulate, the more power you begin to get. The more you, like a dragon, sit on your gold and protect it, right? And you work to accumulate more. So the cheap and easy question is, once the revolution happens and the party is in power, how do you stop the bureaucracy from corruption? That's it.
Thank you, Peter. Classic question and a really important one, and I'm sure one that lots of people are wondering about. So thank you for bringing that up. Next, I have Rob and nobody else. And I will beg the rest of you, not just Peter. I'll beg everybody, please come on in. Let me know if you got something to say. I'll add you to the speakers list. There we go. We're trickling in. So again, I'm going to limit this 4 minutes max. I'll let you know if you're pushing time. I'll be a bit more stern about that going forward so we can get everyone in. But Rob, you're next. I'll unmute you.
All right, first time. Okay, calling in. First time caller, long time listener. Happy to be with you. So just to touch on the fascism question and America and all of that going on. I think one good way to I want to phrase that I think kind of sums up my feelings on this is, back, we have a saying, they sell you down the river. And that was a saying that in plantations, they would use that for slaves to say, if you step out of line, we'll sell you further south where they'll be more brutal. And that is what I get sometimes when I hear oh, I'm not going to do anything for you, but that guy down the river, ooh, he's a real mess. He's going to mess you up. And that is kind of the stick and carrot that centrists use against us. And we see when they're in power, they do nothing to stop it. When we see when they take power, they don't have the basis and the power to actually push back on that, which is why we do need to build a working class, solidarity and working class power. And that means building with the person you meet, that works at your bread place, or the guy that, the teacher, the nurse. That means believing in regular people and believing in us to organize ourselves, to defend ourselves. If we look at the stuff that's happened in, the United States, that's a lot of people that, are in democratic areas that haven't seen that. For them, they saw a father get killed. And for them, fascism to a way has already come to them under the Democrats. So for them, that's already feeling okay, this is a system where both of these things, neither of them is helping me. So that is the perspective you got to think about it. Are we building people that are going to be sometimes every 4-year allies, or long-term cadre that are going to help build us and be part of a mutual revolutionary organization that can engage in these things? That's what I think is the difference there, is building that in that degree. And if I am speaking out of turn, please apologize, but that's kind of my take on it. I'm still kind of new, so yeah.
I'm muted. I got to unmute myself. Thanks, Rob. No, that was great. Definitely not out of turn. You spoke right in the turn that I put you in, and your points are great. Thanks, Rob, for calling in. So next I have on the list here is, wait, just making sure about this. Yes, Chad. I ran out of room on my paper. So Chad is next. If you're ready to go, I'll unmute you.
Cool, thanks. I just have a question. I guess a lot of these talks have kind of centered around the idea of learning from history and kind of looking at the mistakes that have been made in the past during revolution or leading up to revolution or as people are organizing. And my question is, what would those who are kind of in the leadership, I guess, of the organization of the IMT or of the a Fight Back or anything like that, say that, I guess, where would they say they have drawn the most inspiration from in their organization moving forward from these lessons of what Rob talked about tonight, or other revolutions or other gatherings of bright minds? Just wondering, kind of where people draw their inspiration and how they think they can move differently if there was to be a revolution. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, great question, Chad. Thank you. Someone, I'm sure, actually, this is one thing I didn't really say. There's no real rules here. If you want to answer someone else's question, I believe other people have been doing that. You're free to come in on discussion. If not, if no one answers your question, I'm sure Rob is keeping notes, so am I, of what people ask and all that stuff. So Rob will have some time at the end to wrap up and address questions as well. So no pressure either way. So next on my list here I have is Alejandro. And I could use more people. I could use a couple more people in this discussion before we sign off for the night. So if you were not sure about saying something, maybe now's your time to shine, and we would love to hear from you. So I appeal one more time for people to come in, but before that, let's get Alejandro on the line. I'll unmute you here. Okay.
Hi. First of all, thank you to Michael and Rob for everything. And also, I'm having a hard time trying to translate my thoughts into English right now, so please bear with me. What I wanted to ask is, having my family from like Central South America, being African indigenous, and hearing their stories about all the different confrontations between, you know, like far right movements and communist movements, where they just have like kind of like PTSD, where they see that, you know, throughout history everything's fallen apart, and they've become more pessimistic about actually having a socialist movement actually working. Like, how can we, like, what's the best way of addressing that? Like, how can we reinvigorate them and give them hope, give them more positive outlook, rather than just seeing what they've seen and just staying stuck in that point in time? Thank you.
Yeah, really great question, Alejandro. Thanks. I will let someone else come in and answer it, but I do, you know me, this is my job. I do want to plug this big old thing that I have here. As Rob mentioned, it's got, briefly, there's a whole bunch of detail here about communists from all over the world meeting together in this Communist International. And one of the things, this is 1920, so the wording that they used was the colonial question, all these colonial revolutions that were happening in, you know, countries like India, countries like China, countries like all of the countries in Africa, all over the world. There was a colonial revolution, and the previous Second International had a pretty chauvinistic perspective on it. Rob kind of touched on this, and this book goes into all the debates of correcting that perspective and all the people who participated in it from those countries and from everywhere. And so if you're interested, this is again another reason to check this book out, but people can come in with more detail or examples as well. So next on my speakers list, I have room for a couple more questions. So if people want to come in, ask a couple more questions, I have room for that. This might be my last, one of my last calls, maybe my second to last call for more people. So if you've been thinking about it, I encourage you to get in. But while you're thinking about it, while the gears are turning, I'm going to ask Natalia to come in on the speakers list here. So Natalia, whenever you're ready, I'll unmute you.
Oh, hello. Yes. Okay. Well, thanks, Rob, for thanks, Rob, for the presentation. I thought it was like a really nice historical overview. I want to talk a little bit about what was going on in the sort of like in the aftermath of World War I and the Communist International position on the on the national liberation movements that were taking place after World War I. As you can imagine, these imperialist powers only strengthened their hold in their colonial properties, trying to, you know, secure their position after the events of World War I. And a question for the Communist International was, okay, how do we position ourselves in the face of the national liberation struggles that are taking place in these colonial countries as a result of the brutality of colonialism and imperialism? And the position of the Communist International was an advance to the position of the Second International, whereas the Second International had sort of a more vague position and sometimes really like bad positions that I would get into. The Communist International was clearly in defense of the right of nations to self-determination. And basically, they emphasized the fight against imperialism and colonialism. And they sort of also emphasized the fact that national liberation could only be achieved through the fight for socialism. It would not just be an abstract fight against imperialism. We hear this abstract fight even today, like we're just fighting imperialism. But the Communist International was very clear. The struggle for national liberation, to be successful, has to be a struggle for socialism against imperialism and against capitalism. And this is because imperialism is like capitalism at its highest stage. You can think about it as capitalism on steroids. It's brutal wars, environmental disasters, refugee crisis, all these things brought about by the epoch of imperialism. And so for the subjugated nations, it was extremely important that they would be fighting against not only like this their colonial masters, but the system, the economic system that sort of kept perpetuating that colonial relation. And so actually, like, I think that my intervention is sort of related to Alejandro's question, because I think, in South America, like a lot of indigenous peoples, like they still are struggling for their right to self-determination. And I think that, yes, there may be some pessimism that's natural. I think just because of the world that we live in, it's like natural for anyone to fall into that. But I think that you can point to some of the struggles that have been waged by indigenous people, and in Mexico by the Zapatistas, for example, or in Chile by the Mapuche, who have been at the forefront of the movement that has been taking place in Chile since October of last year. Point to these revolutionary developments that are being spearheaded by indigenous people, but not only these two examples. Like, I think the lesson of internationalism as well, which is sort of like a lesson that we get out of building the international, is that look at all the struggles that are taking place everywhere by the oppressed people everywhere, and how do we make these struggles successful? How do we achieve our aims of economic and social liberation? And I think that bringing them together under an international with the banner of socialism was the aim of the Communist International, and it's a name that we're still fighting for today as the International Marxist Tendency, with this legacy of the first four congresses of the Communist International. And I think this is still relevant. Like, this question of national oppression is still relevant today. It's still going on today. And so the fight for national liberation against national oppression is not something that we'll leave to the distant future after the communist revolution. We'll think about that. It's a struggle that we're waging today, like I said, against capitalism, against imperialism. It's a struggle against a system that actually thrives on the oppression of nations and of peoples. And it's a struggle that together, I think, we can win, and that it has to be waged internationally.
All right, thanks so much, Natalia. That was really interesting, and I think a pretty good explanation there. So next on my speakers list, well, we are coming into the last sort of 25 minutes of the event here. Want to kind of wrap up by 9 so you can get on to the rest of your day if you have to get up early tomorrow or something like that. Of course, after 9, we're going to be doing breakout rooms, and we're going to be staying around and sticking around socially. So if you would like to stay later, that option is available too. So I will do, I said a second to last call. I'll do my second to last call here for anybody who wants to get in and ask questions, bring up disagreements, bring up thoughts, anything that maybe people haven't touched on yet that you'd like to talk about. We have a little bit more room. So please do that. If that's you who I'm talking about. So next I have on the speakers list is Oliver from Toronto, I think. Yes, Oliver from Toronto. So I'm going to unmute you, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Rob, for the excellent lead off. I was going to come in on a similar theme as Natalia to addressed a few questions about where we get inspiration, what can give us hope and help us overcome, the forces that would promote pessimism, and also to Peter's question about how do we prevent kind of degeneration. I think that was the spirit of his question. So I would say the Russian Revolution is definitely one of the biggest events that we draw inspiration from. It's the greatest event in human history, we would say, where the working class not only gained but held on to power for a significant amount of time for the first time in history. So I would say learning from history is one way to defeat pessimism, to learn all this buried history that the bourgeoisie tries to bury of the working class's strength and power. From the Russian Revolution, there are a lot of positive and negative lessons there that, again, to to tie this to the theme of the discussion that are discussed in the first 5 years of the Comintern. In terms of, if you're looking for more reading, the history of the Bolshevik Party, Alan Woods has a book called Bolshevism that's excellent on how the Bolshevik Party overcame periods of pessimism and defeat and demoralization. And in terms of the degeneration that happened later, Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, is the great one to go to for that. But in terms of more contemporary examples, Natalia mentioned a few. I think the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. is very inspiring, a little bit closer to home. Shows the working class's determination to change society. And the fact that the majority of the population supported burning down the police precinct shows how much consciousness is changing, and how much people are willing to come together and fight, overcoming racial barriers. You know, it's the biggest mass movement perhaps in recent history, definitely in the U.S. But to the question of how do we prevent kind of betrayals, I would say, really, honestly, there's no guarantee. Lenin, there are some important principles. Lenin outlined these in State and Revolution that came from the experience of the Paris Commune that Marx analyzed as well. So workers' right to recall of all officials. So you don't just come in on one platform and then betray it and you're stuck with them. Workers representatives on a worker's salary so that you don't gain this salary that separates you from the base that you're supposed to represent. No standing army but the armed people, and the rotation of roles as well, so that, if, as Lenin put it, so a cook can become prime minister, or if everyone's a bureaucrat, no one is. So really, at the end of the day, though, if there is any guarantee, it would be education, learning these lessons, and also a strong internationalism. That's what we're trying to build here in the IMT. And sort of to wrap up, Alan Woods is fond of quoting Spinoza. He said, "Our task is not to weep or to laugh, but to understand. And through understanding, we will change the world."
Awesome. Thanks, Oliver. A couple of really great discussions here. I think in the spirit of both of what Natalia and Oliver said, this is why we do what we're doing. This is why we're getting together. The more that we can share this information, educate each other, keep our brains sharp. This is the only, we don't, like Oliver says, we don't have any guarantee. I like these thoughts a lot. Thanks, guys. So, like I was saying, we're coming into the end of the event here. So if you want to get in and say something, I've got one more speaker on my speakers list. I will make a last call for any additional speakers. It has to be quick, though. That's your penalty for waiting so long. You might not get 4 minutes, but if you want to say something or ask something really quick, you can come in. Marissa, you can have 4 minutes because you had raised your hand a while ago. But anybody else? Last call. If you want to come in and say something quick, the floor is open. Otherwise, after Marissa, I will hand it over to Rob. So, Marissa, I'm going to unmute you now.
Great. So, I think Oliver actually did a good job of answering the standing questions in the discussion. I think just to bring things, I was thinking about Alejandro's question though, because I know Alejandro, you raised that in a previous discussion as well. I can understand how it would be something that's quite important to you. And I know that there are a lot of people with similar experiences whose families come from revolutionary backgrounds in countries that might have gone through, revolutionary defeats, and have family members who have a hard time getting past that. And I think in some ways that's just there might not be any way to get them to move past it because it is such a heavy experience. And that the best thing, and one thing that we've said, I think over and over again, is that experience is the best teacher for people. And if someone was to come out of that kind of demoralization, the best way to do it is by seeing that things can actually change and that we can actually win. The best way to help people who are in that place is to do a good job of being revolutionaries now, in proving that we can build and we can win and we can start to achieve some victories. And just to bring things back to Trotsky himself, Rob, went over the history of the Third International and a bit about its degeneration, and then the Fourth International and what became of that, and that Trotsky was a driving force throughout all of this, and of course he himself went through some quite terrible experiences, from being in labor camps as children, being murdered or dying, and things like this, and particularly during the Stalinist degeneration, the old Bolsheviks were put into labor camps, forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit. Many were driven to suicide. One thing that was noted about the Trotskyists, when the left opposition throughout all this, is that they did not lose their morale. That there were stories about them, in the labor camps, going to be executed, singing the Internationale, still believing in what they were fighting for. And I think where that comes from is from being able to have a long view of history. The only place you can really get that from is a full understanding of Marxism itself, and understanding that history is greater than our own actions and greater than this one time, and that we're in right now. And having a scientific understanding of history as well in the class forces that work, so that you can understand that regardless of how we feel right now, the working class is the strongest that it's ever been. And when the working class decides to move, nothing can stop it. And those are objective facts. Those are objective scientific facts. And I think the better you understand Marxism, the better you understand history, the better you are able to understand this and use that as a motivating factor. And I think, that went a long way to, inspiring the members of the left opposition through these difficult periods, and Trotsky himself, who, never lost sight of the goal of a communist future. So, yeah.
Nice. Thank you, Marissa, for the inspiring end to our discussion, because those were inspiring words. I think that was great. And, there was one last quick hand with Panise. I think I'm going to limit you here to just 1 or 2 minutes if you got something quick, just so we have time for Rob to wrap up. I didn't see, because I think you raised your hand here in the last couple minutes, so I'm going to limit you. But if you want to get in really quickly, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to unmute you here, Panise. Thanks for getting in on the conversation.
Thank you. Sure. Sorry, I wasn't planning on talking because I really should be studying right now. But somehow I got I got sucked into the event. So yeah, I just wanted to reiterate some things. Hopefully not be too repetitive, so I will keep it short. But some of the questions Alejandro and I think Chad asked as well. There is nothing more frustrating than being genuine and passionate about the struggles in the world without having a genuine Marxist understanding of history and the world, because you end up hearing arguments like the ones that are super valid from our family or friends who have these, who have experienced defeats in the past. But like everyone said, through reading these past things and and seeing the history and seeing that none of these defeats were inevitable. I think that's the major point, because then you can have conversations with people, and we don't have to defend Stalin in order to defend the planned economy, and that is an issue like on the left in certain like groups. But we can do both. We can be very honest about the crimes and the problems of like past revolutionaries or movements, while still understanding that it was not inevitable that these would fail, and that there were gains made, showing that eventually when it is attempted again, hopefully it goes well, that these issues, that it is possible to see good come out of these things. So yeah, like there are misconceptions, but the more we read these things, we understand how to answer them from a genuine place. And based off of that, and the other question was like things that inspire us. Again, the Russian Revolution, reading the struggles of past Marxist revolutionaries is very helpful in this, especially when you come across parts where it seems like you've gone through the exact same thing in 2020 with your comrades, and it's just really trippy, but you see that they have struggled through these similar things, and that the role of the revolutionary organization is so important, that subjective factor, because when you look at these past events, like somewhere like Germany, where the working class was so strong and the conditions were ripe for socialism, versus in Russia, where it was kind of less expected. But of course, the revolution doesn't wait for anyone. And that is why the role of the revolutionary organization is so crucial, because just seeing like the commitment and the proper like analysis and long-term thinking of these revolutionaries is what allowed these revolutions to succeed. And so off of that, I do urge everyone to join us and build a revolutionary organization, so that, the larger we are and the more prepared we are when the revolution does come, the better off we are than like past revolutionaries. And I'll leave it there.
Nice. Thanks, Penise. That was a lot of ideas in a very concise amount of time. So thank you for stepping into the end of the conversation here. I appreciate that a lot. I just saw a couple of people raise their hands, and I would say sorry, but I did make a couple second last calls and all that stuff. And I have to cut it off somewhere because we got to give Rob time to answer any points raised in the discussion here and get people home so that they can wake up in time tomorrow for whatever they need to do. So if you do have things that you wanted to talk about more, we will be having breakout rooms. So a lot of us will be sticking around and chatting these things out. So hope you enjoyed the event so far. I have a couple more words to say at the end, but for now, let's let Rob wrap things up. Rob, over to you. I'm going to unmute you.
Thanks, Michael. I'll try to be brief here so we'll end at a reasonable time. In terms of the question on fascism in the United States, I think it's been answered very well by other people, and various points have been raised. But I just want to say a couple of things, and that's that I don't think an alliance with Biden or the Democrats is possible, even if we wanted one. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Democrats would rather lose to Trump than win with a progressive like Bernie Sanders. And look, when Trump's talking about shooting people in the head, Biden says shoot them in the leg. I mean, I don't see much of a fundamental difference there. And like was pointed out by others as well, most of the places where there's been some extreme violence from the police and so on, they're actually controlled by the Democrats. And so historically, the ruling class, even its liberal wing, will side with the fascists over the working class. And that's all the more so true in the case of a socialist or a communist revolution. History showed that repeatedly. So I think the best way to fight, these fascist groups or to fight Trump or Trump and his supporters in the United States is the establishment of a mass socialist party. And others have pointed out there's ample support for such a party. And Bernie Sanders and the DSA could do it. They could easily do it. Well, maybe not easily, but they could do it. And from here, once you have a mass socialist party and a mass socialist party in the United States that's combative and militant and radical, then it would be a lot easier to establish a united front of all the socialist trade unionists and against fascist groups, And any time demonstrations or meetings are threatened, we need to help and defend each other. And that's really the basis of the United Front. Now, that doesn't mean that if there's some Democrats in some area or some individuals who want to come help defend against fascism, we're going to say no. But it also doesn't mean that we have to go reaching out to Biden for an alliance either, you know. And I think, what was it, Rob? You kind of asked if you spoke out of turn or whatever. I don't think that's the case at all. I think you hit the nail on the head. And everything you said is precisely why the left, the unions, the socialists in the States, they gotta break with the Democrats. They are not our allies. They are, in fact, the preferred party of the American ruling class, which has done untold violence to people, working class people, all around the world. And there's really no fundamental difference between the Democrats and Republicans. I'm going to read out this Gore Vidal quote, which I think I read out at just about every leadoff these days, where he said, "There is only one party in the United States, the Property Party, and it has two right wings, Republican and Democrat. Republicans are a bit stupider, more rigid, more doctrinaire in their laissez-faire capitalism than the Democrats, who are cuter, prettier, a bit more corrupt until recently, and more willing than the Republicans to make small adjustments when the poor, the black, the anti-imperialists get out of hand. But essentially, there is no difference between the two parties." And I don't think that any of the great Marxists in history could have said it any better than that. And just a few things in terms of this question of like sectarianism and what we consider to be sectarian. Basically, anything that doesn't really take into account the actual consciousness of the people around you, of the working people around you, of the working class in general. So rather than kind of denouncing everything and shouting at everybody, you kind of want to put things in a positive way. It is really about kind of winning friends and influencing people. You have to understand the consciousness of workers and where they're at, where they're coming from. So, for example, when it comes to the NDP or Quebec Solidaire or this whole thing that happened in the Green Party around Lascaris and the eco-socialists, you see a lot of Marxists or so-called Marxists and communists just denounce them. Oh, they're reformists, they're traitors, they don't understand. It's not a Marxist party. Well, who would expect a Marxist organization to drop from the sky fully formed with a perfect program? These things are built in struggle through events, right? So, of course, we're critical of the NDP and we're critical of Quebec Solidaire. We're critical of Lascaris and what he's doing. But to go around and just simply denounce them doesn't really convince anybody and doesn't really win anybody over, because most people don't actually understand where you're coming from. So you need to make your critiques in a friendly way, put on positive demands, and put it in a way that people will understand, especially so that when the reformists do betray, which they do most of the time, then people will see with their own eyes what you've been talking about. And so that's the whole point, is that the revolutionary movement is actually built through political struggle, through engaging with these movements, not just from, denunciations on the sidelines. And in terms of, the kind of what you can do to prevent corruption or the degeneration of the revolution. Again, I think that was answered very well by others. But I always think of Venezuela, because I think the Russian Revolution is pretty far removed, and it can be kind of difficult to understand exactly what happened. But you can see it very clearly in Venezuela, that the revolution went so far, and it gave a certain layer of people a lot of privileges, new positions, new power, new positions in the bureaucracy, the state, and the military. And for that layer, the revolution went as far as they wanted it to go. They got what they wanted out of it. So now they're putting the brakes on, and they're stopping the spreading of the revolution, and they're stopping the deepening of the revolution. And so that in and of itself is one of the key ways to prevent that corruption and that degeneration, is to continue spreading the revolution internationally to other countries, which reinvigorates the revolution in your own country. And also all the democratic measures that people were talking about. If you have workers' democracy, if the people can control their leaders and recall them and all of that, then you can prevent a lot of the worst excesses of bureaucracy. And had the Russian Revolution not been isolated, had it been able to spread, particularly to Europe, then the entire basis for the rise of that caste, of that bureaucracy, it would have been taken away. So it wouldn't have happened, or at least it wouldn't have happened to such a severe degree. So I think that's one of the key things is to remember the internationalism and the democracy of the revolution. And then just in terms, I think I'll end on the question of, how we can kind of overcome the defeats of the past, and how we can remain inspired and confident, and how we can kind of reach out to some of the older layers who have lived through some terrible defeats and struggle. And it can be really difficult actually to maintain that inspiration and that confidence in the movement and in the working class. For example, I got interested in Marxism in the 1990s. That was an awful period. It wasn't very long after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China's embracing capitalism. The left everywhere is getting its ass kicked. The unions are dwindling. The NDP and everybody else is abandoning any talk of socialism. It wasn't fun times to be on the left, I'll tell you. But you do gain inspiration from the struggle itself. Do you know what I mean? From the revolutionary movements that we've seen around the world today. For example, the big Black Lives Matter movement in the States this summer, that was enormously inspiring. And it shows that we're right to have that confidence in the working class and its willingness to fight. And the youth as well, it's a different question. Like I'm starting to become one of the old timers, and we can very easily get demoralized and grumpy about things. But the youth are always there. They haven't been through those defeats. So they still have that raw confidence and that willingness to fight. And that in and of itself can be very, very inspiring. But it can be difficult. I mean, I think everybody goes through periods of being very inspired and wanting to go out and fight the revolution. And then other times where you're kind of demoralized and you just want to stay at home. But I think you have to remember too, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. I mean, you kind of look at this question of the revolution and it's like a big mountain and we're at the very, very bottom. And if you keep looking at the peak, it can be pretty daunting. But if you just keep your eyes focused on the movement and on what's going on around you, you can kind of keep things in perspective. But the fact of the matter is we have suffered many, many, many losses. I mean, the fact that we're sitting around here talking today means that we've lost a lot of times. And we seem to lose all the time. But there's a big difference. Our enemies have to win every single time, and they have to keep winning. We only have to win once. And when we win that one time, it's all over for them. And I'll end it there.
Okay, sorry. We had a little technical blip. Thank you so much, Rob. I am unmuted so I can see things off for the end of the event. Thanks again, Rob. That was really interesting. I hope everyone here got a lot out of it. I'll just quickly reiterate some things before we break out into rooms. You've already heard me say this stuff, but this book that we were talking about today, all these revolutionary lessons that we can learn from the past and analysis that we can apply today and method and so forth in this book, in our bookstore, Marxist.ca, links in the chat. Again, you can also get in touch with the local branch if you're interested in getting involved more seriously with us and all the other work that we do. We don't just hold public events, although that's a big part of what we do. We do all kinds of other stuff. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can follow those links as well. And you can see what we're up to on at least a monthly basis with our publications. If you want to subscribe, either in French or in English or both. My webcam's not big enough to do what I'm trying to do. We got subscriptions, we got books, and we got stuff to do in your area. So get in touch with us. And we won't have any more Marxist universities for this semester. Today was the last one. So thanks, Rob, for closing it out on a high note. That was really cool. But we will be holding future events, so stay tuned with us. In fact, probably the next thing on the plate is what I was mentioning earlier about the United States, our sister organization there, Socialist Revolution. Actually, I have one of their stickers. Socialist Revolution in America is holding an analysis of the election and actually a whole school of events and discussions on the weekend of the 14th and 15th. So just a little more than a week away. Rob Wilson, I think, is calling in from the States, and he's got his Socialist Revolution shirt. So thank you, Rob, for showing us that. That's super cool. I want one of those. They look great. All right. So without further ado, let's one of my co-hosts here, somebody else who's managing the Zoom chat, is going to start breaking us out into breakout rooms. So if you want to stick around and hang out a little bit informally, socially, talk about some of the ideas we discussed today, please feel free to. And that will be happening soon. So thanks again for joining and all the great questions and discussion, and hopefully see you guys around soon.